So I kept my half of the bargain. I hope you'll keep your half of the bargain. Remember what the bargain was, the little deal we made last week? Yeah. I prayed for you this past week while I was on my little retreat over in Assisi in Rome. And I really did. I got into Rome on Wednesday morning and took the train right up to Assisi. And after checking in at the hotel where I stayed and then taking a little rest, I went to the church. First stop was the Church of St. Clare, where she is buried. And in that church, on the side, one of the side chapels is the cross of San Damiano. Now, if you know anything of the story of St. Francis, you know the significance of that cross. I've always had a great love for St. Francis and that whole thing, and though never had a desire to be a Franciscan. No, thank you. Too many rules. But if you know anything of his story, you know that after his conversion, he went to that church of San Damiano and prayed there, and that's where he heard from the cross the words of our Lord speak to him, and the words were, "Rebuild my church, Francis. Can't you see it's falling down?" Of course, St. Francis thought he was literal and started rebuilding the church because it was lying in ruins. And he learned later that that's not exactly what Jesus had in mind. He had something much bigger. And so I prayed there for the parish, especially because of the rebuilding that we're attempting to do here in the parish and how important that is and what that all means. And I remembered everyone there. And then, not that I didn't at other times, but the second time that I was particularly conscious and in prayer for all of you was this past Tuesday morning. And it really happened kind of by luck, because it's one of those kind of things that when you go to Rome and go to the Basilica of St. Peter's, it doesn't happen. You got to make reservations months in advance, and a couple of emails and talking to the folks in the sacristy at the Basilica, I was able to celebrate Mass at the altar where our patron saint, John the 23rd, is entombed. And that was just a great thing, being able to, there he is, right there, entombed, and I was able to celebrate Mass. And for you, for the parish, I prayed there. So I kept my side of the bargain. I hope this Thursday, especially, you'll keep your side of it, okay? Let me ask you a question. On a scale of 1 to 5, how generous do you think you are? 1 being very ungenerous, 5 being very generous. On a scale of 1 to 5, how generous do you think you are? And I'm not speaking specifically or only about financial generosity, the money that you give away. I'm speaking of all generosity, because it goes beyond just money. It also has to do with the time that you give to others and the way you use your talents to benefit others. Things like volunteering and being neighborly. How generous are you? Do you think you are? Okay, I'll ask you another question. Same scale, 1 to 5. How happy are you in general about life? Your general sense of happiness in life. How happy are you? 1, very unhappy. 5, very happy. Where are you in that scale? Do people see you as a happy person? And just, you kind of go through life just like, yeah, okay, no problem. What about your general health? And I'm not talking about injuries like what I'm dealing with, but just health in general. How are you there? Same scale, 1 to 5. How about maybe your general well-being? And that's not so much happiness, but just the way you approach life. And, do you find yourself being miserable all the time and people want to stay away from you? Or do you have this sense of, life is good? And then your purpose in life, same thing. Where does that, on that same scale, does your purpose in life fit? I know what I'm doing. I know where I'm going. I know what God wants me to do. Or, having a clue. Did you know, it's interesting, what studies have been done, and those who rate themselves low in areas of happiness and health and well-being and purpose in life also rate themselves low in generosity. People who are unhappy, unhealthy, generally are most ungenerous. On the other hand, people who rate themselves high in happiness and health and are also very generous, generally speaking. It's a paradox that people who are generous are more happy and healthy and have that greater sense of well-being and purpose, while those who are ungenerous do not. And that really is going to be the theme of this little series that I'm going to talk with you about over the course of the next couple of weeks till we get to Lent, and Lent's right around the corner. It'll be here before we know it. And in actuality, it's a series that I preached a few years ago, 3 years ago, and I've updated it a bit and changed it around, but I wanted to share it again. I thought it was important. This paradox of generosity, with this subtitle, "In giving we receive, but in grasping we lose." When we hold on to things, we lose, but when we let go, we get all kinds back. That's why I use that image of the open hands. Generosity is a repeated behavior. It's not a single act, and it requires a recurrent and deliberate intention and attention. Pay attention. Something that we have to pay attention to in our lives, and we have to do it intentionally because it shapes our lives. It gives meaning to our lives. It's the habit of giving without expecting anything in return. And that giving includes financial resources, but it also includes volunteering, developing relationships, even being neighborly. It's interesting that the origin of the word generous has the same origin, it's the same word for nobility. Those two words have the same root. It's interesting. You think about people who are of noble birth. Well, they were expected to be generous because it was thought that they had the means to be generous. Those of noble birth held positions of authority. They were the kings and the queens. They were the dukes and the duchesses, that sort of thing. They were the ones that had the means and the ability to be generous, and so they were. We look at Jesus, and the people looked at him, and there was nothing special about him. They didn't see him as having any kind of noble birth, and so they thought what he was doing was absolutely, utterly out of this world. It was strange. It was something that just, they couldn't believe that he would do such a thing. Except for the man in the synagogue with the unclean spirit, and when he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are." You see, Jesus apparently was not of a noble birth. He came from Nazareth, a little podunk town on the east side of Jabbip that, in John's gospel, one of the disciples says, "What good comes from Nazareth?" I mentioned that a couple of weeks ago. And he was the son of a carpenter. What's up with that? Now we know, and the people who were listening to him would eventually figure it out, that indeed he was of noble birth. And that indeed the practice that he would practice, the ultimate form of generosity. He would give everything, even his own life. And all were amazed and asked one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority?" And Jesus' act of generosity really does underscore the power of his authority. And it really proves that he's the real deal. He's legitimate. He's someone that we can follow. On the other hand, for you and I, we might excuse ourselves from being generous. Who here is of noble birth? Anybody? Any nobility in the background? Anybody here? No, I don't think so. You guys mostly are sons and daughters of miners from Tamaqua. I come from Sinking Spring. What kind of place is that? At best, we might believe that we have our ability to be generous is limited. And at worst, of course, we might not even believe that we have the means to be generous. And then additionally, the culture in which we live dictates that generosity is indeed somebody else's responsibility. It belongs to the government to take care of those things. It belongs to the diocese. Besides, I pay my taxes and I put my money in the collection basket. I put my $1 or $2 in the collection basket. What more do you want? But Jesus' life teaches us of the power of generosity. And that it brings about happiness and health and well-being and purpose in life. But not only does it teach us that, Jesus shares his life with us. And he does that through the sacrament of baptism, whereby we become sons and daughters of a loving Father. And as a result, we have a noble birth. Every one of us who baptized have a noble birth. And we share in Jesus' authority because we share in his priesthood. And therefore, we have the capacity to be generous. Our lives have been given a higher quality, a higher goodness. And there then is an expectation that we practice the art of generosity. In fact, we have reason to be generous. In fact, if we look deeply, we even have the means to be generous. Some years ago, I played a round of golf with a fella, and we walked and talked as we played. And as we were talking, we talked about generosity, and it just happened to be a topic of conversation. And he was telling me about what he did with his life. He was a financial advisor. And as a financial advisors help people manage their money, whether they have a lot of money to manage or a little bit. He doesn't care. It's just people need help managing money. And he and his wife had made a decision that they would give away 10% of their income, and to different charities, to the church, in different ways. But they were going to, right off the top, before any of their household expenses were paid, they were going to give away 10% of their income. And then came the Great Recession of 2007, 2008. And what they discovered, even though it seemed like everything was falling apart in the financial world, they kept getting more back. And they kept giving it away. And all their bills were paid. I had a conversation, maybe I got about a month ago. You remember I had that with a parishioner, a conversation with a parishioner. Remember back in the fall I preached that message series on abundance. Remember that series, Abundance. I had a conversation with a parishioner, and he said that he and his wife had decided to become percentage givers. Remember, that was one of the things that I strongly encouraged. Don't just put $1 in the collection. Put a percentage of your income. The tithe. He said to me, well, Father, it's only 3%, but it's more than we ever were able to give in the past, and more than we ever gave in the past. And he went on to tell me about his daughter, and she was in college, and how this was going to affect their ability to support their daughter as she went through college. But he went on to tell me that she had gone to some conference or another and had to do some kind of presentation, or I don't know what, I forget all the details of it, but that she had won a $5,000 scholarship. And that more than covered what they had decided to give in the collection. Lest you think that this only happens when people are generous with money, it's equally true with those who are generous with their time and their talents. And I know more than a few people who have given of their time and talent right here in their parish. They've volunteered. They've come to me and said, what can I do, Father? Well, you could do this, that, or the other thing. They haven't waited to be asked. They've just volunteered. And They've been generous because they really don't have the means to give financially. And because of their generosity, their lives have been deeply affected. In fact, I know at least a few who have a much better sense of health about their lives, a greater sense of well-being about their lives. And I'm going to talk next week about how that happens. For now, it's important to remember this, that no matter what generosity takes, when it's done to honor God, God has a unique kind of way to open up paths in our lives so that things that otherwise would be impossible under normal circumstances happen, and often enough, happen easily. Generous people look at what they have, look at what they have been giving, and while taking care of themselves and those that they're called to care for, like children, they willingly give away a portion, a percentage of their financial resources or their time. They share their talents with others. They share their emotional life with others. They act neighborly towards others. Generosity, though, only happens with a conscious, deliberate choice to go above and beyond what we might think is normal. And that going above and beyond happens only over time, with small steps, with a willingness to ask God to open the door to enable us to be generous. And that might be as simple a thing as, well, today I'm going to dedicate myself to smiling at everyone I meet. Or today I'm going to dedicate myself to saying hello to anyone I come across. Just today. Those small steps. I guess herein lies a challenge. And it's to look at those places in your life where you might be reluctant to be generous. And that reluctance might come from the fear of being taken advantage of or being rejected. But if that happens, so what? What difference does it make? Because you've been generous, because you're doing something that God asks us to do. And it doesn't matter how the other person responds, because generous people recognize that that brings health and happiness into their lives. Generous people don't suffer from depression or addictions, and because they allow God to work in their lives. But it must be authentic. It must be lived and believed and practiced as a real part of life, because only then can the well-being enhancing properties of generosity kick in. So what matters most is that it be practiced throughout the whole of life, and that might begin today, and not something that we consider doing only once, because it is a repeated behavior that is intentional and commands our attention. Jesus was generous with his whole life. Our baptism demands that we do the same.